Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. My name is DK Bhattacharya. We'll be talking about Mesolithic cultural chronology. Before we go into Mesolithic cultural chronology, we must realize some important facts of the emergence of Mesolithic culture. For a long time, we have taken it as a small transitional period from Paleolithic to Neolithic. And this small transition may not be chronologically controlled. Sometimes it happened later, sometimes it happened earlier. Whatever, the the reasons or the range of reasons for which this transition occurred need to be considered. One of the reasons that was argued was this, that Holocene marks a change of climate, and when the change of climate came, two things happened. The large mammals which were adapted to Pleistocene period and climate were all migrated or went extinct. Some of them went extinct, some of them migrated to the northern latitudes. We have one which is still there in the northern latitude, and that is called Rangifer tarandus, or reindeer. Now reindeers are still surviving in the northern latitudes, but earlier it was found in the middle latitudes as well. So you find that most of the large mammals are gone or migrated, and man was left high and dry because he had to adapt himself to some new subsistence base. Incidentally, the beginning of Holocene caused the creation of a large number of bogs and lakes. The dry areas, like interpluvial areas, the rivers became dried and they created what is known as horseshoe lakes. In the wet areas, the glaciers melted down, and the water, some of them went into the sea and some of them got trapped into depressions, forming big lakes. And you have lakes high up in the mountains, like Nainital for instance. You have a lake high up in the mountains, and if there was a way for the water to pass through, it would have gone through was flown into like any river. So you have these kind of lakes all over. Also, the beginning of Holocene marks the 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 submersion of many part of land, and land bridges were all gone because the sea water covered it and islands were formed. And man had no other alternative but to adapt to this new ecosystem. Now, this is environmental archaeology. This new environment, man had to adapt himself. Some of them migrated to the northern latitudes also. Maybe their descendants are the Eskimos today. But those who did not, they had to adapt to the new environment. And they found huge number of birds coming to these lakes. And these birds were all eating fish from the lake. So lake was full of fish. There were virgin lakes full of fish, and there were birds coming. Now these birds, which could give as much as 5 to 6 kg of flesh, couldn't fly very high. They would hop around and large, like stork for instance. A man thought he will try to adapt to this ecosystem and this subsistence base. And he found that his Paleolithic tools were not suited for these animals or these fishes, and he created very small microliths. Very small, insignificant microliths. The first thing he sacrificed was the weight of the stone because he wanted it to fly. And if it could fly, he could create what is known as bow and arrow. We know how a bow was created. I've talked about it earlier. It was found during the high wind currents. Big trees will bend down, and when the wind is gone, the tree will come back to its original position. So man, as a keen observer of his ecosystem, saw that nature has its own elasticity. So this elasticity of a tree for bending down and coming back was harnessed by man to create his bow. So a bow and arrow was created for the first time in early Holocene. We know it because we have cave paintings of Holocene period, of Mesolithic period, coming from Levant in West Asia, and also from Bhimbetka, where bow and arrow is shown as a hunting implement. So man took to hunting with bow and arrow, and this hunting is called fishing and fowling. This is not large mammal hunting. And since it is not large mammal hunting, it requires no stalking. Large mammal hunting requires large amount of stalking. You have to run after the animal for days together, and then possibly you can trap one of those large mammals. But fishing and fowling required no running around, so to say. And since he didn't have to do any running around, the body fat increased. Now this body fat is very interesting. When the body fat goes down, women stop ovulation. women are infertile when the body fat goes down. In medical parlance, it is called postpartum amenorrhea. Postpartum amenorrhea means when the mother is breastfeeding, the mother is infertile. So the same thing happens when the prehistoric people are hunting and moving around. Their body fat is expended and they remain basically infertile. It's a beautiful way of God's mechanism of seeing that a hunter or a hunting gathering community is not saddled with two babies when they have to all the time walk around and move around. So the second baby will be formed or will be created only after 4 years. So there is a long period of infertility in the hunter-gatherers. And the moment they took to fishing and fowling, the body fat increased and women became fertile and women became, evolution started. So without knowing, man started multiplying exponentially. Exponential growth of population is 4 to become 16, 16 becomes 256. So the community started multiplying without knowing the reason. Because the environment changed, man had to shift to fishing and fowling. And he had no alternative. But he didn't know that this change of subsistence base will cause in him a kind of increase in his population strength. And the moment the increase of population strength comes, you have a problem of intensifying your eco base. So you have to create more and more subsistence base. Having said as much, we will accept that early Holocene man got trapped into a new eco-based adaptation, that is fishing and fowling, and then he had to intensify it in a rapid way. I repeat, intensify in a rapid way because population started increasing. Now, if you take the tools that come from this period, that are the microliths. The microliths were taken to define Mesolithic period. So, early Holocene microliths. Of course, there are microliths now found well within Pleistocene, but they are not called Mesolithic. They will be called microliths of the Upper Paleolithic period. But then you have situations like Batadomba Lena in Sri Lanka, where microliths are found from 28,000 BCE. So you know it is a Pleistocene microlith. So you can't call them Mesolithic. So Mesolithic stands defined as that cultural period which is of early Holocene period. But there is a crux in it. Early Holocene in a traditional way was taken as beginning from 10,000 BCE. It's a very traditional acceptance that Pleistocene ends at 10,000 BCE. There is a man called De Vries who did some kind of geomorphological analysis of frozen lakes and interpreted, and he came out with the theory that no, Pleistocene continued up to 8,300 BCE. So what was taken from 10,000 onward till 8,000 BCE was earlier called off as Mesolithic because that was the early Holocene. But now Holocene being shifted to 8,300 BCE, this part of Holocene culture, which was earlier Mesolithic, had to be given a name. So it was given a name Epipaleolithic. Epipaleolithic was given a name to one cultural group or a cultural stage which precedes Mesolithic. So the sequence is like this now. The cultural sequence. You have Upper Paleolithic, then you have an Epipaleolithic, then you have a Mesolithic, and of course Mesolithic goes on till you come to Neolithic. So if you look for cultural sequence of Mesolithic, you find though it is a very small period, it is a transitional period, and that is why it's called Middle Stone Age. Earlier is Early Stone Age, later is New Stone Age, and this small period is Mesolithic period, is Middle Stone Age. But still, this suffers from a large amount of internal changes because of the rapid changes that was occurring. Why was the rapid changing occurring? Because the population was increasing in a rapid way. The population was increasing in such a rapid way that the only way of management of such a population is possible only through what is known as fission and fusion mechanism. Fission means if there is a mother group called A and it has to eventually become two group A1, A2, and A1, A2 will subsequently become two more two groups B1, B2. So there is a ramification of fission, Fission. A fission occurs as the only mechanism of adapting to an eco-base because of rapid increase of the demography. So the rapid increase of demography is not a problem when we're dealing with Paleolithic analysis. It was not a problem when we deal with Neolithic analysis. It becomes a problem when you talk of cultural periods or Mesolithic period and its cultural variation. So we create a Mesolithic cultural division on the basis of this rapid change of population, one place to another, a population migrates to another group, and so on. So you find Epipaleolithic. Let us look at Epipaleolithic. Epipaleolithic has no definitional attribute which can put it in terms of types and techniques as different. You know, when you talk of Mesolithic, on basis of types and techniques, you can define Mesolithic. On the basis of chronology, you can define Mesolithic. Mesolithic is that period of culture which comes from early Holocene in terms of chronology. Mesolithic is that period of culture which is entirely prepared of microliths, and the technique is fluting technique. That is on the basis of typotechnology. You have a definition, but you have no definition on typotechnology for Epipaleolithic. Epipaleolithic is contextual. Epipaleolithic is something which is kind of in between Mesolithic and Upper Paleolithic. So you don't know where Upper Paleolithic changes into Mesolithic. So this Epipaleolithic group was not found everywhere, but G.R. Sharma of Allahabad University in a site called Chopanimando identified an Epipaleolithic. I don't know on what basis, but certainly this identification was the first time in India where a kind of Epipaleolithic stage within Indian Pleistocene and Holocene boundary was identified. Let us try and develop some kind of typotechnological definition for Epipaleolithic. You know that Upper Paleolithic you get beautiful blades, thick blades, and these thick blades, sometimes as much as 4 to 5 centimeter in length, these thick blades are prepared by what is called punching technique. They are not prepared by fluting technique. Now these punched blades are thick blades. You have the large number of gravation points, you have the aurignation blades, you have the strangled blades. These are thick blades. Certainly pressure flaking cannot bring these flakes. Now these blades, when they are not pressure flaked, shall I say the blades are small but they are not pressure flaked, then let us say this will be considered as Epipaleolithic. I repeat again, Epipaleolithic, I am trying to create a typotechnological definition. And on typotechnological ground, I say if I have blades, no matter how small they are, even they may be have the same size as microliths, but if they're thick and they are made by punching technique and not pressure flaking technique, I will call them Epipaleolithic, depending on if they're the terminal part of Pleistocene. So the chronology becomes the crux of the definitional attribute. If they're of the terminal part of Pleistocene and they're made by punching technique, no matter how small they are, how microlithized they are, I will call them Epipaleolithic. But in terms of types, the Epipaleolithic tools will have more or less the same types that you have in Upper Paleolithic. So I am trying to develop a kind of unstable definition for Epipaleolithic all over the world. It has not been identified all over the world. It has been identified only in North Europe, and we call them as Federmesser group of culture. In India, it has been identified only at a site called Chopanimando in Allahabad district, and I have identified in one group of Jharkhand site called Jhurpania, where Epipaleolithic tools have been identified. In other words, Epipaleolithic tool assemblage will have no lunettes. Epipaleolithic tool assemblage will have no trapezes. Epipaleolithic tool assemblages will not have obliquely blunted blades. So you see, the typotechnological attribute that goes to define a pure Mesolithic is quite different from what is identifying as Epipaleolithic. Having said as much, I can say that Mesolithic also, pure Mesolithic, which comes after Epipaleolithic is over, pure Mesolithic will be a early Holocene episode. And you have microliths galore. And all these microliths are prepared by what is known as pressure flaking technique. You have also larger tools, larger cores, and especially large microlithic fluted codes are often obliquely broken to create what is known as end scrapers. So you have macro component also in microliths, but they form a part of Mesolithic culture. In order to make a Mesolithic cultural sequence, since it is a small period, it has been accepted that we will try to make a cultural sequence of Mesolithic period in identifying two groups. One group was called geometric microliths, which was the youngest one, and the other group was called non-geometric microliths. Idea was non-geometric microlith is closer to Upper Paleolithic or Epipaleolithic, and geometric microlith is the youngest one, and the ones which follows non-geometric. So a chronology within Pleistocene, within Mesolithic culture also has been attempted in terms of typology, not technique. Technique for geometric and non-geometric remains the same. In terms of typology, non-geometric does not have a trapeze, does not have a isosceles triangle, but geometric will have trapeze as also isosceles triangles. There is, however, still an issue that keeps floating on the air, and we are not able to nail it down in a very absolute ground. That's because this transition is not universal. This transition in Western India, for instance, let's say Gujarat, cannot be compared with the transition that will happen in Bankura, say in Eastern India. The transition in Southern India may be not occurring at the same time that is happening in Northern India. So you have varied length of time within which this transition is occurring. And it is true that some of the Mesolithic sites are as young as 2300 BC. 2300 BC is the date of a cluster of more than 100 Mesolithic sites coming from Mehsana district of Gujarat. They are called Langnaj group of sites. Now, Langnaj group of sites are pure Mesolithic, yet they are contemporaneous with mature Harappa and is not very far. Just 100 kilometers away, you have the huge mature Harappan site in Gujarat, and that is called Lothal. From Lothal to Langnaj, one can go in a taxi. So here, Lothal 2300 mature Harappan site, Langnaj 2300, the same date, a pure Mesolithic site. Not even a single potsherd in it. So a scenario of this kind has made a cultural chronology of Mesolithic very imperative. Though we do not have any typotechnological ground on which we can say these are late Mesolithic. We had done it about late Mesolithic being those which have trapezes and called the geometric Mesolith. But then we have late, this is very late, 2300 BC. 2300 BC, half of Western India has become Copper Age. Yet you have a microlithic culture, not one site, more than 100 sites. So we can make a kind of cultural division of Mesolithic in the following manner. You have Epipaleolithic that leads to the non-geometric Mesolithic, and non-geometric Mesolithic leads to geometric Mesolithic. Now that's in terms of a grand scale of occurrence. But if you take regional occurrences like Langnaj, for instance, then you start considering the possibility of pure Mesolithic with transitional Mesolithic. Now pure Mesolithic with transitional Mesolithic, there are large number of examples from Western India. You have Kayatha, you have Gilund, you have many sites in Western India, Northern Maharashtra, Jorwe, where they are Chalcolithic sites, but the Mesolithic layer is having 100% Mesolithic tools, of course with trapezes and all, geometric Mesolith, but with handmade pottery in it. So you have handmade pottery, you have no metal, you have no Neolithic attributes, but handmade pottery comes seeping in the Mesolithic culture of this variety. So when you take the regional concept, mind you, the grand concept we have already made, the Epipaleolithic, the non-geometric Mesolithic and the geometric Mesolithic. That's a grand scale, which is not there in the regional variety. I gave you the regional variety of Langnaj and Lothal, and I have tried to examine a kind of Mesolithic which is late staying Mesolithic. No, talking about regional varieties of Mesolithic. Cultural chronology cannot be beyond the three levels that I've talked about. But when you go to the regional varieties, we find varieties like Langnaj with Lothal, and in Hoshangabad district there's a rock shelter, and the rock shelter is called Adamgarh. Adamgarh has a lot of cave painting also. Adamgarh has a lower Paleolithic cultural layer also. But the Mesolithic cultural layer is very interesting. It occurs right after Lower Paleolithic. That means Lower Paleolithic continues with a flake component, and after the flake component, call it middle or upper, whatever, after the flake component immediately comes Mesolithic. There is a date also. The Mesolithic date is also 2300 BC. Now this microlithic layer is pure Mesolithic, but here there are large amount of bones that has been found, and most of the bones, about 50% of them, have been found as domesticated animals. And the domesticated animals include sheep, goat, and pig. Now you have a concept that animals are domesticated only during Neolithic period. Neolithic is a period of production economy. So you can produce crop or you can produce animal. So animals are referred to in Neolithic economy as food on hoof. Food on hoof means that is also capable of multiplying. So having a domesticate, an animal which you have domesticated, means also production economy. In that way, the occurrence of the animals which are identified as domesticated in Adamgarh in Hoshangabad district with microliths galore immediately proves that it is contemporary with a Neolithic economy. But since it has only microliths, you have to call it as Mesolithic. So these are the issues of the regional developments which shows different shades of late Mesolithic having elements of the younger culture which is Neolithic. I've given the example of Langnaj group of cultures, and I'm giving you the example of Adamgarh now. Let us take another example of Navdatuli. Navdatuli is in central India, and it is on the bank of Narmada, and the meaning of Navdatuli is it is the village of boatmen. Navdatuli. It's a village of boatmen. And here is a Neochalco site, and the amount of microliths that you get there, amounts of good pottery that you get there, and the amount of Neolithic celts that you get there leaves no doubt that you're dealing with a Neolithic or even late Neochalco culture. But what do you do about the microliths? So when I'm trying to create cultural chronology of Mesolithic culture, I take the liberty of asking you to include these Neochalco cultures also, in which large amount of microliths still continue. In other words, microlithic preparation as a technique and type continues from well within Pleistocene to almost the end of Chalcolithic period, because Harappa also has a lot of microliths. So you have this technique and their types occurring continuously. In order to try and make calibration of cultural layers within it, it becomes a problem, because you cannot make cultural division on chronological markers. Because you can have chronological markers which are as old as 5000 BC from a site called Bagor in Rajasthan, Bhilwara district of Rajasthan, where the microlithic layer is 5000 BC. Then you have a microlithic layer coming from Bhimbetka, which is a primary site, which is a rock shelter, and there the date is again about 3000 BC. So chronology cannot enable you to make what is called cultural chronology. So cultural chronology has to be based on the fact of cultural attributes. And I'm trying to do that. In order to make a cultural chronology, I've chosen to use only cultural attribute. And then I've said older, younger, or less younger, and so on. I'm trying to make a chronology only on cultural attribute. It's so easy to make a chronological arrangement of all the Mesolithic sites. And you can say, here is a Mesolithic chronology. But it makes no sense culturally speaking, because there are varieties of Mesolithic in India. The transformation was slow in Middle Ganga Valley, so slow that it has given rise to a Epipaleolithic, which is in Koldiwaha and in Chopani Mando, and you have no Epipaleolithic elsewhere. So you have all varieties, and you can't make a general statement of a chronology of Mesolithic in India. And I think it is quite correct to talk about cultural chronology, and in order to do that, we make a statement that Epipaleolithic is the oldest, which is the ground from which Mesolithic evolves. And this Epipaleolithic is very well identified in terms of types and techniques. I have talked about the types and techniques which differentiate Epipaleolithic from Mesolithic. The types and techniques are, we still do not have a pressure flaked blade. We continue to have the punched blade and tools made on the punched blade. And you also don't have any Mesolithic tool types. So what you have are the points. You have the obliquely blunted blade, which is like gravation point, and so on. And you have very good number of burins and borers. So burins and borers, frankly speaking, marks the main tool type of Epipaleolithic, which is not so much in Mesolithic. End scraper is another type which is quite common in Epipaleolithic, and end scrapers are not very common in Mesolithic. And even if they occur in small flakes, which is called the thumbnail scraper in Mesolithic. So you have a stage of Epipaleolithic, then you have a stage of what is known as early Mesolithic. And the early Mesolithic is typical of what has been found in Bagor in Bhilwara district, which is 5800 BC. So you have early Mesolithic where there is no geometric tools. And this early Mesolithic finally leads to what is called a late Mesolithic. Now the late Mesolithic is the one which shows varieties when you look at the regional distribution. I gave you the evidence of the varieties coming from Langnaj vis-a-vis Lothal. Lothal is a Chalcolithic site, is a mature Harappan site, and Langnaj is a pure Mesolithic site, but they occur at the same time. So these are the late Mesolithics. I have also given you the evidence of a rock shelter, or a group of rock shelters. I think there are about 6 rock shelters, and this is from Hoshangabad district, and they are called Adamgarh. Adamgarh has large amount of late Mesolithic occurrence, and this is very interesting. These late Mesolithic culture occurs directly above Paleolithic. And Paleolithic means only hand axe cleaver and of course some flake component. So you have a late Mesolithic where large number of bones have been found, and the bones have been identified as domesticated species. So you have domesticated animal which contradicts Mesolithic economy, but we have to accept it as late development, as a development which is permeated from the younger cultures near around. So they might have been surrounded by younger cultures, and their effect must have come into them in the form of domesticated animals. We accept domesticated animal only in Neolithic period. We don't accept domesticated animal in pre-Neolithic culture. And Mesolithic in Adamgarh has to be accepted as a late Mesolithic with some effects of the younger culture coming in it. And the effect of the younger culture that comes in it is the occurrence of domesticated animal. I give another set of examples from western Maharashtra, northern Maharashtra. These are in Madhya Pradesh, Kayatha, Gilund, and these sites, this group of sites have shown again 100% microliths, nothing else, but handmade potsherds along with that. So you don't know what you call them. You can't call them Neolithic, you can't call them Mesolithic. So you have to accept them as a late Mesolithic in transition. Langnaj is a late Mesolithic in transition. Adamgarh is a late Mesolithic in transition. Gilund, Kaitha is a late Mesolithic in transition. Comparing these kind of developments where you have the possibility of identifying 4 cultural chronology within Mesolithic with Europe, you find no such possibility there. In Europe, if you see the Mesolithic developments, it is from 6000 BC Tardenoisian and going up to 3000 BC Atlantic phase to the pre-boreal phase. So you have 4,000 BC of development in Middle Europe, or let us say mid latitudes, where you have microliths and microliths and microliths and nothing else. So you can't identify a transition, you can't identify inner or internal succession, that one Mesolithic layer is leading to another Mesolithic layer, but you certainly have variations. You certainly have variations like the kitchen maiden group, which will have different characters than Tardenoisians and Azilians. But there is one group which is called Erteböl in European Mesolithic, which has potsherd, a small little potsherd, and a bone combed, C-O-M-B, comb. So you see a development where an effect of a younger culture is permeating into the Mesolithic metamorphosis. So Mesolithic in Europe is much more insular, much more isolated development of an economy which must have been swept over by the younger group. When the Neolithic came, they all took them in by surprise and possibly changed them into slaves or whatever, because you don't find a transition. Now this is very interesting. Wherever you find 100% change, you know there has been an invasion. But look at India, we don't find 100% change. Then you know there is a slow change, slow acceptance of newer things. And you know these internal changes are showing a kind of acceptance of the new without being totally relegated. And this is a very interesting phenomena that you find in India. The old is never replaced by the new. Old continues with the new in a different way. I give one example. You know, pottery in the older period used to be the only utensil, and when metal was discovered, the pottery was not discarded. And you find pottery even today. What happens is that pottery goes to the uh, uh, temple. It's an esoteric level. It's no longer utilitarian level, it is esoteric level. And the same thing happens when copper is given up and steel comes. The steel is taken over, but the copper doesn't gone. Copper continues, but in an esoteric level, in the temple, and in purity concept, only copper is used. What I'm trying to say is that India tells you, especially when you look for Mesolithic chronology, then you cultural chronology, you see in India a kind of development of the old into the new in a mature way, in a systematic way. Whereas when you look at the Western Europe or Central Europe, the old is totally replaced by the new. And you know what must have happened. Either they have been killed, or they have been taken as slave by the new culture, or they have been taken as labor by the new culture. Now this is the mannerism of change of cultural chronology that you see when you compare with Europe. I don't have to compare with Africa. In Africa, the change is again gradual. You find the Mesolithic culture continuing with pottery for a long time. There must be pottery developed elsewhere, and it enters into the Mesolithic culture. Now this is a very interesting development of the tropical world as compared to the temperate world. Thank you.